Thank you, Jenny. Once again, we welcome all the scholars here, and guests and interested people in our topic today. And I would like to give a brief introduction of the organizer, as mentioned by Jenny. This is the organizer of the event Carbon Footprints. It's an open access new journal. The editor-in-chief of the journal is listed right there. And he is a good friend of mine as well. He's the dean of the School of Engineering, Professor Yoon. And the editorial board, as you can see, is international in terms of different locations and different places. The aim and scope is to look at carbon emissions and managing carbon emissions overall to address, of course, one of our most critical and grand challenges of the climate change issues, which I'll get into under one of the grand challenges concerns. And there is a article processing fee, but it can be waived, especially for the special issue, if you submit in time. And the topic of the special issue is digitizing carbon footprints management, which is actually the theme of this webinar as well. So if you are working or interested in this area and want to develop it in the digital technology beyond blockchain, we're looking at blockchain today, but more digital type of things, then do consider sending into the special issue. And the articles, the type of articles that we have are basic research articles, reviews, synthetic, short communications, and commentaries are welcome if you wish to put your ideas out there. Of course, all of these will be peer reviewed. And if you do it early enough, I think that we will waive the article processing fee. And I think it's until November or December of this year. I think it's November of this year. So do please consider this a special issue. It's a little marketing push for my special issue in this case. Now, let's go over to the webinar and briefly go over the speakers. And of course, we'll talk about them a little bit more. And I introduced them very quickly. The pictures are off a little bit. We were discussing that beforehand. And we have three speakers, Professor Abdullah Yıldızbasi, who is from Turkey, but he's been visiting us at School of Business, and he's a visiting scholar as well as a teaching professor there right now. And the topic will be circular safety, can blockchain help? The titles are going to be a little bit different. We're looking at broader perspectives of blockchain and grand challenges, but I've asked each of the speakers to also talk about the carbon emissions management or carbon relationship to what they're studying as well. We also have Professor Yanji Duan from the University of North Florida, the College of Business. And her talk will be a blockchain and supporting carbon neutrality claims. And again, whether consumers really trust this. So she's going to be talking about this from a supply chain perspective as well. And finally, our third speaker from the continent of Africa is Dr. Matthew Kaysan. And he will be talking about some of his work that he's been doing with blockchain and sustainable supply chains, especially with smallholder farmers and the cocoa supply chain. And he touches a little bit about the carbon emissions issue, but especially the issues of trust. And again, he'll be describing those things. Each of the speakers, the way this is structured, after my brief introduction, and I will give a little bit more introduction in terms of grand challenges and blockchain and sustainable supply chains. Each of the speakers will be talking for about 15 minutes. If there's a little bit of time that's available, they might get one question, but realistically, it's going to be very tight for the first three presentations. But if you do have questions, and we do highly recommend it, please put your questions in the chat so at least we can remember them, and we'll go through them at the very end. We have about 15, 20 minutes after the presentations for a general panel discussion, as well as a discussion with the participants who are here. So please do have your questions ready, and you could do it beforehand. You could do them during it. We'll go over the chat box. I'll be going through the chat box to see what type of questions exist, and maybe even call you up and we'll unmute you and you can ask the questions directly. 15, 20 minutes can go by very quickly, so try to keep your questions as focused as possible, and that would be good. And you could either direct them to all the panelists, or some of the panelists and I might guide a little bit of that of who should be asking what or so on. Or I may not. It depends on how the questions come up. So that's the structure of our webinar for today. And I'd like to welcome all the attendings. And I mentioned this, the journal homepage, you got the QR codes there. There's going to be QR codes that pop up in different places. So you can take some of those QR codes and they send you to different links. That's the brief introduction into the webinar. Now what I'm going to do is shift over to a little bit of background material related to grand challenges and sustainable supply chains in the blockchain to essentially set a foundation of information because maybe not everybody here knows a little bit about the blockchain or what the grand challenges are. I imagine many of you do know because you're here and are interested in the topic, but there might be some who are relatively novices. I am not going to go into detail here. There's just too much detail to go into, but I do have a couple QR codes that will come up to say, if you want more information, why don't you go to this location as well? That way we keep it moving a little bit faster. So first of all, grand challenges, when we talk about grand challenges, and there was a paper the other day from a management journal that said, what are grand challenges? There's a bibliography, a review of the definition of grand challenges. Most organizations, most scholars look at sustainable development goals as where the grand challenges begin. And if you're not familiar with them, they're right up here. There's 17 different goals, many different metrics in the sustainable development goals of the United Nations, from poverty, hunger, health, and well-being. And I circled a couple that really relate to what we're doing here. We have responsible consumption and production, SDG 12, with the supply chain issues, especially in circular economy, as well as climate action. This is why we're having this, because carbon emissions are causing climate concerns. But I should also say that every single one of these is impacted by decisions we make in other areas. And there's an issue that's going on here. And the reason why these become grand challenges because they don't affect only their specific SDGs, but there's a relationship across them. And we will see this in every single one of our presentations in different ways. And now the grand challenges, as we mentioned, many of the SDGs are considered grand challenges. And there's another term that's being used as the wicked problems. Now, wicked problems, and this is why they're grand challenges, are very complex challenges that lack clear solutions and boundaries. This idea of wicked problems really comes from optimization and management science tools and techniques, saying no one model can solve this. And actually, no one philosophy can solve these issues. And there's a lot of interacting issues that come across. So there's no classic formulation, no easy solution to these wicked problems. And carbon emissions and climate change are clearly one of the world's most grand challenges and wicked problems. Now, typically, wicked problems have trade-offs, but we also say that there's potentially co-benefits. And we'll see some of these co-benefits related to blockchain and how they can contribute not only to carbon emissions reduction or carbon emissions management, but also to other things like waste management, pollution, poverty, sharing, limiting corruption. Those are types of things that are co-benefits with actual use of blockchain, but also trying to address climate change as well. So look for some of these in some of the presentations as well. Now, what is sustainable supply chains? This is something that is also a very vague term. And circular economy, because we're going to be talking about closing the loop and all these circular economy practices that may exist. But sustainable supply chain, circular economies work hand in hand. Some are considered linear, some are considered non-linear. There's a circular system, and there's many activities. There's going to be some of this that's being touched upon in different presentations. But I want to say that the complexities here are very large, whether it is related to waste management or the relationship between waste management, resources usage, energy usage, and carbon emissions exist throughout the supply chain. And the best one that I have is my older one here, 1992-95, which actually shows activities. But here, I'm also going to be talking about blockchain. We're going to also be talking about blockchain. Blockchain has many characteristics, and I'm not going to go into detail what a block is, what a chain is, and how data gets put on, and the systems involved. there's a lot of information that exists out there, so I'm going to assume that there's some basic knowledge here. But some of the characteristics of blockchain include things like smart execution, tokenization, which is incentivization, smart execution of smart contracts to make things efficient, transparency, and immutability are very critical to be able to trace information and to make sure that the data is accurate, reliable, correct, and we'll come back to some of this, as well as decentralization. And the idea here with decentralization is that there's multiple stakeholders. And when we're talking about carbon emissions, there are multiple stakeholders. Those who have to use certain things, those that have data to manage it, those that want to invest in reduction. There's multiple issues with data management across the supply chain related to blockchain. And here, what we show in this paper, and now this paper here, you could go to the QR code. It will bring you this to give you a lot more about sustainability and supply chain and blockchain issues. This is directly from the paper, which essentially says, look, information is being shared on a dyadic basis here, the two groups at a time, but with the blockchain, a lot of stakeholders involved. And look, it's also circular. It happens to be circular because the information is accessible by anyone throughout the supply chain. And we're looking at closed loop supply chains, regular supply chains, and whether or not the data is accurate. And the thing that we're going to be looking at is how does this manage the carbon emissions data as part of the blockchain. There's also a negative side of blockchain. I'm giving you the positive sides. One of the biggest concerns is that the blockchain takes a lot of energy, and that is also being studied. So now we have a trade-off between blockchain as a supporter of carbon emissions reduction, but also as a contributor. And that might come up in our discussion. I look forward to having maybe a question or two on that as well. And this is back to the supply chain and where blockchain. This is from another paper by Kohizada and Sarkis from 2018. The QR code is right here for the paper. So if anybody wants to do that, they could take a picture of the QR code. It'll take you there. But what I showed here is places where carbon emissions in the supply chain. The supply chain to run requires energy. Energy requires fuel. Fuel generates carbon emissions. That is some of the major concerns here. So you can do emissions trading to manage the supply chain, energy management, to keep records, smart efficiency type measures. I also put here S3 over here at the vendor selection and supplier development, but S3 can also occur here. S3 is scope 3 emissions. That is a lot of the emissions that occur in the supply chain and that need to be managed are outside the organization, but upstream and downstream. And those are considered scope 3 emissions. That is my brief overview of the various and many complex topics, just to have you start us out with some of the things. Many of you may have heard of these, and this is just to bring them up to the forefront.